Elon Musk had always been known for his cool, collected nature. His rise to success was not built on bravado or quick reactions, but on a deep understanding of strategy and patience. But on a private jet, somewhere between destinations, a moment would come that would put his character to the test in a way few had ever seen. What started as a routine flight would quickly become a scene no one on board would ever forget. An unexpected insult from a fellow passenger would challenge Musk in the most unexpected way, and the world would soon see that sometimes, strength lies not in a forceful response, but in how you carry yourself when confronted by disrespect. The moment was unassuming at first. Passengers settled into their seats as the jet hummed through the skies. There were the usual murmurs of polite conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of papers as people prepared for the journey ahead. Elon sat in his usual spot, his thoughts drifting between the pressing matters of his companies, the next big projects, and the challenges of being one of the most recognized figures on the planet. The plane, luxurious and quiet, provided a moment of peace, something rare for someone of his status. Then, from a seat a few rows behind, a voice broke the calm, cutting through the air with sharp words. "I've heard of you, but I don't see why you're so special. A man like you should be used to people like me, shouldn't you?" The words weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. The insult wasn't just a criticism of Musk's work or his accomplishments, it was a personal jab. It seemed casual, perhaps even meant to be playful, but to Musk, it was an affront, and the discomfort in the air became palpable. Elon's first reaction was one of surprise. His mind, trained to focus on the most complex of technological problems, was momentarily derailed by the unexpectedness of the insult. Was this person really challenging him? Of course, Musk had faced criticism before, from every corner of the world, public and private. But this felt different. There was something personal about the remark, a challenge that seemed to cut deeper than usual. The other passengers, though, were more stunned by what happened next. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur, the visionary who reshaped industries, sat still. He didn't react in anger, didn't lash out in defense. Instead, there was silence. A heavy, thoughtful silence. It was a silence that commanded attention and sparked curiosity. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they had misheard or if something dramatic was about to unfold. The question on everyone's mind was, how would Musk respond? The insulter, clearly expecting a fiery retort, grew impatient. He leaned forward, probably anticipating that his words would spark a battle of egos. But Musk didn't flinch. His face remained calm, his expression unreadable, and the silence stretched on. The tension in the air became more palpable with each passing second. It was almost as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Would Elon defend himself? Would he rise to the bait, or would he choose to let it go? The minutes felt like hours. Some passengers exchanged nervous glances, others shifted uncomfortably. Yet, Musk remained unshaken. He didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge the insult in any way. It was almost as if he was waiting for the situation to unfold on its own. The insulter, sensing that his words were having no effect, grew bolder. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he added, his voice now dripping with condescension. And still, Elon didn't respond. But there was something extraordinary in his silence. In that moment, Musk was not just a man on a private jet, surrounded by wealth and luxury. He was a man who had learned through years of experience that true power did not come from quick reactions or outward displays of anger. True power came from within, from the ability to remain calm and composed when others expected the opposite. The other passengers couldn't help but watch, wondering what would happen next. Would Elon speak up? Would he let this moment pass? It was a delicate moment of suspense that would soon reveal the depth of Musk's character. Little did they know that this exchange, brief and seemingly insignificant, would leave a lasting impression on everyone in that cabin. The lesson that was about to unfold would be a far greater story than anyone could have predicted. Would Musk's powerful response reveal a new side to him, one that would change the way people saw him forever? Or would this incident remain just another fleeting moment, lost in the annals of time? The insult, though casual in tone, cut through the air with the force of a thunderclap. The man who had spoken seemed unaware of the gravity of his words, but for those who were listening, it felt like something far more significant. The moment Musk was insulted seemed to freeze time. The insult itself wasn't a rare occurrence for Musk. He had faced public ridicule, harsh criticism, and outright disdain throughout his career. He was a man who had ventured into industries where failure was a real possibility, and success was anything but guaranteed. But this wasn't just any insult, it was personal. The remark wasn't about his companies, his vision, or his public persona. It was an attack on him as a person. And worse yet, it came from someone who didn't even know him. The man who had spoken was sitting a few rows behind Elon, oblivious to the power of the moment he had just created. He had been talking to the person sitting next to him, loudly and without any apparent awareness of the tension he was stirring. His voice, laced with mockery, was dripping with a sense of superiority that seemed misplaced. "I mean, seriously," the man had said, "what is it about people like him? You'd think he's some kind of genius, but he's just another rich guy who's in the right place at the right time. Nothing special." The words hung in the air, and everyone on the plane felt them. But it wasn't just the content of the insult that left a mark, it was the underlying arrogance in his tone. It was as though he didn't even consider that the man he was belittling might be someone important. His ignorance of who Musk truly was made the insult sting even more. To Musk, it wasn't just about the words themselves, it was the lack of respect, the assumption that someone like him, a billionaire and innovator, was somehow less deserving of admiration. The passengers, who had been quietly minding their own business, began to sense the tension that was building. Some were even afraid to look up, unsure of what would happen next. The insult had shattered the quiet harmony of the flight, and now all eyes were either on Elon or the man who had dared to challenge him. A few passengers exchanged glances, some quietly amused by the thought of someone mocking Musk without knowing who he was. Others looked on with growing concern, sensing that this confrontation might escalate into something more than just words. Elon, however, remained still. His face didn't betray any emotion, and his eyes were fixed on the window beside him, as if he was lost in thought. For a moment, it seemed as though he hadn't heard the words at all. But that wasn't the case. Elon had heard every single syllable, and while the insult might have stung for a fraction of a second, he had already begun to process how he would handle it. His reputation wasn't one built on confrontation or heated exchanges. He was a man who had learned the value of restraint, who had come to understand that not every battle was worth fighting. The man, clearly expecting some sort of fiery retaliation, became more emboldened with each passing second. His earlier comment had done nothing to provoke Musk's attention, and now, he felt the need to escalate. He leaned forward in his seat, his voice rising a little, trying to draw attention to his words. "You don't think I'm right?" he asked, louder now, as if trying to provoke a response. Still, Musk didn't react. His silence was deafening. But it wasn't a silence that spoke of weakness, it was a silence that carried an undeniable strength. Musk wasn't ignoring the situation, he was choosing to hold his ground in a way that left the insulter confused and disoriented. Every moment that passed without Musk saying a word seemed to diminish the power of the insulter's jabs. A few seconds later, the man, growing impatient with the lack of response, tried again, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "What, are you afraid of a little criticism? Or are you just pretending to be above it all?" At this, Musk finally turned his head, his eyes meeting the man's gaze. There was no anger. In his eyes, no trace of the indignation one might expect. Instead, what the insulter saw was calm, quiet confidence. For a brief moment, the man felt a pang of doubt. What if he had made a mistake? What if this was someone important? But the doubt was fleeting. He dismissed it almost immediately. After all, who could possibly be sitting on this private jet with him who would be worth this level of respect? The tension in the cabin grew thicker, but it wasn't just because of the man's words, it was because of the waiting. The passengers, once relaxed and going about their own business, now watched as the scene unfolded in front of them. Would Elon respond? Would he put this man in his place? Or would he remain silent, making this insult fade into oblivion with the sheer force of his unshaken composure? The seconds stretched out, and the air on the plane became thick with anticipation. Elon Musk remained still, his gaze unwavering. It was as if time itself had slowed down, and the entire cabin was suspended in a moment of uncertainty. No one knew what to expect next. Would Musk give in to the impulse to retaliate? Would he stand up and confront the man who had insulted him, throwing a harsh response his way? Or, perhaps more intriguingly, would he simply let the words fade into the ether, leaving the insult to wither in its own insignificance? The insulter, now fully aware of the silence enveloping him, grew visibly uneasy. His once confident tone faltered as the weight of the situation began to dawn on him. The passengers around him, who had been caught in the tension of the moment, noticed the shift in his demeanor. He had clearly expected to provoke a reaction, perhaps a heated argument, or at the very least, a defensive posture from the person he had targeted. But what he didn't anticipate was this: Elon Musk's unyielding calm. Musk's posture remained relaxed, his arms loosely resting at his sides, his gaze still fixed ahead. His face was calm, unreadable, as though he had seen this moment 1,000 times before and had mastered the art of letting it pass. It was the kind of response that left the insulter unsure of how to proceed. Did Musk not care? Did he think so little of the insult that it wasn't even worth acknowledging? The passengers, too, began to feel the unease. There was a sense of discomfort, like waiting for a storm that never arrives. Some wondered if the insulter would escalate again, if he would try harder to provoke a response from the man sitting across from him. Others couldn't understand why Elon Musk, a man who had spent his life in the spotlight, with all the attention that came with it, would choose to remain so silent in the face of such provocation. A few moments passed, and the silence was almost unbearable. It was as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for Elon to finally break it. Some people couldn't help but steal glances at him, trying to read his expression. But still, there was nothing. No visible change, no hint of anger, not even a flicker of annoyance. The silence was deliberate, a choice in itself, and that choice was enough to keep everyone on edge. Then, finally, the insulter spoke again, his voice shaking slightly now, as though he realized that his words weren't having the effect he'd hoped for. "What, are you just going to ignore me?" he asked, his tone more defensive than before. "You think you're above this? Too good to talk to people like me?" At this, the tension in the cabin seemed to heighten. Some passengers exchanged worried glances, sensing that things might escalate if Musk didn't say something soon. Others seemed to almost anticipate that Musk would finally react, whether in anger or with some cutting remark that would put the insulter in his place. But Elon's response was nothing like anyone had imagined. He didn't raise his voice, didn't stand up or make any show of aggression. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the man, his gaze steady but calm. It wasn't a look of confrontation, it was a look of quiet understanding. "What's your name?" Elon asked, his voice calm, almost disarming. The insulter, taken aback by the question, hesitated for a moment before answering. Todd," he muttered, clearly thrown off by the unexpected nature of the response. "All right, Todd," Elon continued, his tone still composed. "You've said your piece. Now let me say mine." The passengers around them leaned in, some subconsciously holding their breath. Everyone knew this moment was crucial. What Musk said next would define the outcome of this exchange. Would he dismiss Todd entirely, leaving him embarrassed and exposed? Or would he choose to engage, not out of defensiveness, but to show a different kind of strength? For a moment, there was only silence again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable, it was filled with anticipation. Musk's response would be more than just a retort. It would be a window into his mindset, an opportunity for everyone on board to witness firsthand how one of the most successful men in the world handled a moment of challenge. And then, in a voice that was both calm and steady, Musk spoke again. "You don't know me, Todd. And honestly, I don't know you either. But I do know something about the world we live in. People are quick to judge others based on what they see or what they think they know. But the truth is, no one really understands what it takes to get to where someone else is, no matter how much wealth or success they may have. The man's face flushed slightly, and he looked down at his hands. The tone of Musk's voice wasn't hostile, but it was firm, carrying a weight of truth that was hard to ignore. The passengers, who had been on edge, now seemed to relax slightly, sensing that something more important than a simple argument was unfolding. You see, Todd, Elon continued, strength isn't about shutting people down or lashing out when someone disagrees with you. It's about being able to look past the noise, to understand that not every criticism needs a response. Sometimes, the best way to handle a situation is to stay calm, listen, and then make your decision with clarity. There was a pause, and then Musk added, if you're willing to listen, I can tell you a little more about myself. But it's up to you if you want to hear it. Todd, now visibly uncomfortable, nodded slowly. He had expected something completely different. Instead of being put in his place with words of fire, he found himself listening to a message of restraint, calm, and wisdom that was more powerful than anything he had anticipated. It was a moment of realization for him, a shift in perspective he hadn't expected to encounter on a private jet. The other passengers, too, began to settle back into their seats, each of them contemplating the unexpected turn of events. The tension in the air had dissipated, but it had been replaced with something else, a quiet respect for Elon Musk and the strength he had displayed in handling the insult with such poise. It was clear that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of conflict. It was a lesson, one that would stay with everyone on board long after the flight ended. As the jet continued its journey, the cabin was filled not with the usual chatter, but with quiet reflection. The question now on everyone's mind was simple: what would happen next? After Elon Musk's measured response, the atmosphere on the jet changed dramatically. The silence that had once been filled with tension now felt heavier, but not in the way it had before. It wasn't the oppressive silence of anger or uncertainty. Instead, it was a reflective quiet, as if the entire plane had entered a collective moment of introspection. Elon's words hung in the air, like a gentle weight, their meaning not lost on anyone. There was no showmanship, no bravado in his tone. Instead, his response had carried a quiet strength. One that demanded no immediate reaction, but rather an invitation to understand. Todd, the man who had thrown the initial insult, sat back in his seat. His body language was now far less aggressive than before. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his hands rested on his lap. What had started as a playful jab had turned into something entirely unexpected, a lesson in the power of composure. Musk hadn't shouted, hadn't reacted impulsively. He had merely shown that the true strength lies not in responding immediately to an insult, but in taking the time to process, reflect, and choose how to respond, if at all. The other passengers, once caught in the tension of the moment, now exchanged glances. Some seemed to be deep in thought, others quietly nodding to themselves. The transformation was subtle, but it was undeniable. Everyone could sense it. Musk hadn't just shut down Todd's insult, he had diffused it. With no anger, no harsh words, no ego, Elon. And quiet confidence. He had expected Musk to react in the way many people might, defensive, combative, or dismissive. Instead, he had seen a side of strength that he hadn't known existed. Musk's control over the situation was something to be admired, not feared. Todd sat back in his seat, his eyes glued to the window, deep in thought. The flight continued, and the moments passed in quiet comfort, but the lesson of the encounter hadn't been lost on him. The power of silence, the strength of restraint, it was a lesson that he would carry with him long after the flight was over. As for Elon, he was content to let the silence linger. He didn't feel the need to fill it with more words, for he knew that the most meaningful messages often came without saying anything at all. The atmosphere inside the jet had shifted once more. The energy in the cabin was no longer tense or uncomfortable. Instead, it was filled with a palpable sense of curiosity and quiet admiration. The passengers, who had been sitting quietly during the exchange between Elon Musk and Todd, now seemed to take a collective breath, as if they, too, were processing what had just occurred. The conversation had moved beyond the confines of a simple confrontation. What had begun as a moment of tension had evolved into a deeper reflection on how people communicate, how they react to challenges, and the nature of true strength. Some of the passengers were still reeling from the surprising turn of events. They had expected drama, confrontation, or some kind of heated argument. What they had gotten instead was a moment of profound introspection, a lesson in how to handle conflict, not with force, but with grace and understanding. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man who had been quietly watching the entire exchange cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had settled over the cabin. His voice, though quiet, was filled with a sense of newfound respect. "I have to say, I've never seen someone handle a situation like that," he said, looking around at the other passengers. Most people would have lashed out, but Musk, he just shut it down without saying a word. "It's impressive." Several heads nodded in agreement, and the once tense cabin atmosphere slowly began to return to normal. The passengers, who had all witnessed the exchange, seemed to feel the same sense of awe at Musk's composure. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something far more than just a wealthy businessman defusing an insult. What they had witnessed was a moment of leadership, of strength, and of wisdom that went far beyond wealth or status. A younger woman sitting near the front of the cabin, who had been listening intently to the conversation, chimed in. "I think it's more than just about not reacting. It's about choosing how you want to influence the people around you. When someone insults you, they want you to react. They want to see you get angry or upset, but Musk didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, he made us all think about how we react in our own lives." Her words resonated with the group, and a few others began to add their thoughts. One older man, who had been sitting in the corner with a book in his lap, leaned forward and said, "I've spent my whole life responding to insults and criticism with a knee-jerk reaction. You get defensive, you fight back. But this is different." What Musk did wasn't just about shutting down the insult, it was about staying in control. About not letting someone else dictate how you feel. For a few moments, there was a brief silence as the passengers took in his words. It was clear that the encounter had left a lasting impression on them all. They weren't just reflecting on what had happened between Elon and Todd, they were reflecting on their own lives and how they, too, responded to challenges and conflicts. Todd, sitting behind Musk, couldn't help but overhear the conversation. He had been deep in thought ever since Elon's response, but now, as the passengers around him discussed the situation, he began to feel a shift within himself. The words of the older man, the woman who had spoken about influence, and even the other passengers' recognition of Musk's approach, all of it was sinking in. It was as if a light bulb had gone off in his mind. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how often he had reacted impulsively in his own life. How many times had he lashed out at people, whether in jest or in anger, only to regret it later? How often had he let his emotions dictate his actions, instead of taking a moment to process and respond thoughtfully? Elon had shown him something he hadn't fully grasped before: the true power was in control, not in power over others, but in control over oneself. Todd felt a sense of discomfort, but also a sense of humility. He was beginning to understand the lesson Musk had imparted, not just to him, but to everyone on board that jet. It wasn't just about being right or winning an argument. It was about being mindful of how your words and actions affect others. It was about choosing your responses carefully, and in doing so, leading by example. Musk's words had carried weight, but so too had his actions. He hadn't just spoken about strength, he had demonstrated it in the most unexpected way. The passengers around him were learning from that example, and Todd was no exception. The cabin was now filled with quieter voices, each person reflecting on their own experiences and how they responded to conflict in their lives. The conversation had moved away from the immediate confrontation and had transformed into a more introspective discussion about personal growth, control, and leadership. Todd shifted in his seat, feeling a growing sense of accountability. For the first time in a long while, he thought about his own approach to life. Maybe it was time for him to change, not just how he interacted with others, but how he viewed his own role in the world. Could he handle conflict with the same grace Musk had shown? Could he learn to remain calm in moments of tension, rather than rushing to react? It was a humbling thought, but one that carried with it the promise of growth. The lesson that Musk had imparted wasn't just a passing moment of wisdom, it was something that could change the way people approached their lives. It was a lesson in emotional intelligence, in leadership, and in the quiet strength that comes from choosing how to respond to the world around you. The rest of the flight passed with a sense of peaceful reflection. The passengers, now more aware of the power of their own responses, continued to mull over the conversation that had unfolded. They weren't just flying to a destination, they were on a journey of their own, one that would stay with them long after they disembarked from the jet. For Todd, the journey had just begun. And as the plane soared through the skies, he knew that the lesson he had learned on that flight would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. As the plane continued its journey, the conversation around Elon Musk's calm demeanor and strategic response began to settle, but Todd still found himself reflecting deeply. The more he thought about the exchange, the more it dawned on him how impactful Musk's handling of the situation had been, not just for him, but for everyone on board. Todd had initially seen himself as the one who had initiated the conflict, but now, with clarity, he saw that he had been a catalyst for something far more profound. The realization hit him like a slow wave. He hadn't just received a lesson on how to handle an insult, he had been offered something much greater, the opportunity for personal growth. The shame he initially felt about his actions was now mingling with something else, hope. He could change. Musk's quiet leadership had revealed a path forward, a way to handle life's challenges not through confrontation, but with understanding and thoughtful restraint. But Todd wasn't the only one processing the events of the flight. Elon, too, seemed deep in thought, though his calm outward demeanor never wavered. He sat quietly, looking out the window, seemingly lost in his own reflection. Those who had been observing him noticed a certain quiet strength in him. Elon wasn't flaunting his success or his wealth. In fact, he hardly ever spoke about his accomplishments unless absolutely necessary. It was clear that his power didn't come from what he owned or the projects he led, it came from within. As the plane soared above the clouds, Elon's thoughts drifted back to the early days of his career. He had faced countless challenges, many of them far more daunting than a simple insult. The road to where he was today had been paved with failures, sacrifices, and moments of doubt. Yet, through it all, he had learned a valuable lesson: the true measure of a person wasn't how they handled success, but how they faced adversity. He thought of the countless times he had been criticized, mocked, or underestimated. In those moments, there had been a temptation to react, whether in anger, frustration, or self-defense. But over time, he had come to realize that reactions based on emotion rarely served him well. Instead, the moments of greatest growth had come from choosing a path of composure, even in the face of personal attacks or failures. It wasn't that he didn't feel the sting of criticism. He did, just like anyone else. But Elon had learned to process it, to sift through it for any kernel of truth, and then to discard the rest. The key was not to allow the negativity of others to control how he felt or how he acted. He also understood the immense responsibility that came with his public position. People watched him, analyzed his every move, and sometimes judged him without fully understanding his motivations or the complexities of his life. That was part of being in the spotlight, but it was also part of the journey to self-awareness. As the plane continued its journey, Elon couldn't help but think about how important it was to teach those around him these lessons. He realized that the most valuable thing he could offer wasn't just his ideas, inventions, or products. The most powerful tool he could give others was the ability to handle life with the same grace and strength he had learned to embody. It was then that he decided he would share his story with the passengers. Not to preach, but to offer them a glimpse into how they too could navigate their own challenges with calm and clarity. Musk knew that the most meaningful impact he could have on the world was through the way he lived his life, not just in his business ventures, but in how he interacted with others. Todd, who had been lost in thought, looked up as Musk turned toward him. It was almost as though Elon had sensed his need for guidance, even without a word being spoken. Elon met his gaze and nodded, almost imperceptibly. It was an acknowledgement, a silent invitation to engage in a deeper conversation. Todd, hesitant at first, felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. For the first time since the incident, he felt like he was no longer just the object of a lesson. He felt like he could be a part of it, like he had the power to change. "You know, Todd," Elon began, his voice calm but direct, "the way you acted earlier, it's not something to be ashamed of. We all make mistakes. What's important is what we do after. It's how we learn from our mistakes, how we use those moments to reflect on who we want to be." Todd nodded slowly, taking in the words. He hadn't expected to be given permission to forgive himself. He had expected to be condemned, to be reminded of how foolish his behavior had been. But instead, Musk had opened the door to a much more powerful truth, that mistakes were simply part of the journey, not the defining moments of one's life. "You don't have to be perfect," Musk continued, his tone still warm. "In fact, you'll never be. But you can choose how to move forward. You can choose how you respond to the world. And sometimes, it's not about proving something to others. It's about proving something to yourself." Todd felt a weight lift off his shoulders, a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The burden of trying to be someone he wasn't, of trying to meet expectations that didn't align with who he truly was. Elon's words gave him the space to breathe, to reflect, and to consider how he could approach life differently. For the first time in a long while, Todd felt a sense of possibility. He wasn't defined by the mistakes he had made, nor was he limited by his past actions. The path forward was open to him, and it was up to him to walk it. Meanwhile, the other passengers, having overheard the conversation, began to feel the same shift within themselves. They had witnessed a transformation, one that had started with a simple insult and had blossomed into a moment of profound self-reflection and personal growth. They, too, felt the impact of Elon's words. His ability to see the potential for growth in others was inspiring. As the plane began its descent toward its destination, the cabin had become a place of quiet reflection. The lesson that had started with a single confrontation had grown into something much greater. It wasn't just about handling an insult or learning to remain calm in difficult situations. It was about choosing who you wanted to be in the face of adversity, and using every challenge as an opportunity to grow. For Todd, and for everyone on board, the journey wasn't just about the miles covered in the sky, it was about the transformation that had taken place in their hearts and minds. The flight may have been coming to an end, but the real journey had only just begun. As the jet descended toward its final destination, a quiet sense of change hung in the air. The transformation that had taken place throughout the flight wasn't just about one individual, it was a shared experience, one that had quietly shifted the mindset of everyone aboard. Passengers sat in reflective silence, each of them carrying with them a personal takeaway from the events that had unfolded. Todd was perhaps the most visibly changed. He had arrived at the airport a man who had been driven by a need to prove something to others, to show his superiority, to get validation. He had insulted Elon Musk, expecting to provoke a reaction. Instead, he had received something far more valuable, a lesson in self-awareness, restraint, and humility. As the jet landed and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Todd found himself deep in thought. He had no desire to engage in any more petty conflicts. The man who had boarded the plane, confident in his ability to provoke a reaction from others, was now someone who realized the value of listening, of pausing before speaking, of thinking before acting. His internal dialogue had shifted from one of external validation to one of self-growth. He could already see how different his behavior would be moving forward. No longer would he seek to belittle others to make himself feel better. No longer would he react without thought. Instead, Todd was determined to embrace the lesson Elon had unknowingly imparted to him, that true strength lies in self-control, in choosing the path of humility and composure in the face of adversity. Elon, too, was preparing to leave the jet, but his thoughts were still on the passengers who had shared in this transformative experience. He knew the true impact of leadership wasn't always seen in grand gestures or public success. Often, it was in the quiet moments like the one on the plane, that made the difference. Through his own example of patience, self-restraint, and emotional intelligence, he had shown those around him a new way of handling conflict, not by fighting, but by choosing peace. As he moved through the cabin, many of the passengers glanced at him, some nodding in recognition. They weren't just acknowledging his status or success, but the deeper lesson he had shared with them. They had witnessed a man who could have easily reacted with arrogance, who could have publicly shut down the person who insulted him. But instead, he had chosen a path of quiet strength. He had shown them that the real measure of success didn't come from public victories or winning arguments, it came from staying true to one's values, even when provoked. One of the passengers, a woman in her late 40s, caught up to Elon just before he disembarked. "I just wanted to thank you for how you handled everything," she said, her voice sincere. "You showed us all something I think we needed to see. In a world where everyone is so quick to react, it was refreshing to see someone stay calm. It wasn't just about what you said, it was how you said it, or rather, how you didn't say anything at all." Elon smiled gently, his eyes twinkling with understanding. "I appreciate that," he said softly. "Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not react. The world moves fast, and it's easy to get swept up in the noise. But if we take a moment to pause, we often find the clarity we need." As the passengers filed out of the jet, many of them exchanged knowing looks, a silent acknowledgement of the change that had occurred over the course of the flight. Each one of them had witnessed something rare, not a confrontation or a dramatic show of power, but a quiet lesson in personal strength and self-discipline. They had seen how someone could stand firm without resorting to anger, how a person could hold their ground without raising their voice. And in doing so, they had seen that the most profound changes often come not from the outside world, but from within. For Todd, as he exited the plane and made his way toward the terminal, the world felt different. It wasn't just the physical surroundings that had changed, it was his perception. He felt lighter, less burdened by the need to prove something to others. His ego no longer dominated his actions. Instead, he felt a quiet confidence in himself that wasn't rooted in superiority over others, but in the peace he had found through self-reflection. It was clear now that he didn't need to tear others down to feel good about himself. The validation he had once sought from others had been replaced by a sense of inner peace and purpose. Todd had seen how easily one's actions could be shaped by a moment of reflection, how a single conversation could spark a transformation that would last a lifetime. And Elon, as he left the jet behind, understood something deeper still. He had gone into this flight knowing that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but what he hadn't expected was how this brief encounter with a stranger would remind him of the importance of leading by example. He had always known that innovation and progress were his passions, but today he had been reminded of a deeper truth, that true leadership wasn't just about building companies, it was about building people. The lesson of the flight wasn't one that Elon Musk had intended to teach, but it was one that, in the end, left a lasting mark on everyone. It was a lesson in humility, restraint, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing to respond with calmness rather than anger. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all was that strength doesn't always come from power, it comes from the ability to control oneself, to choose peace over conflict, and to recognize that every challenge, no matter how small, is an opportunity for growth. As the final passengers disappeared into the crowd, Elon couldn't help but smile. He had witnessed something truly remarkable, the transformation of not just Todd, but everyone on that plane. And in the end, that was a far greater success than any business venture could ever offer. The journey had ended, but the lesson lived on. For Todd, it was clear that the shift in his mindset wasn't temporary. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where he no longer needed to prove himself to others, but where his strength came from within. For the other passengers, it was a reminder that life's challenges weren't just obstacles to overcome, they were opportunities to grow. And for Elon Musk, it was a reaffirmation that the greatest lessons often come from the most unexpected moments. As Todd walked away from the terminal, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. And in his heart, he carried with him the lesson he had learned that day, the quiet power of restraint, the strength of humility, and the undeniable truth that the way we respond to others says more about us than any words ever could. Life, after all, wasn't about winning battles or outshining others. It was about finding the courage to rise above petty conflict, to make choices that align with one's values, and to offer others the grace and understanding that we ourselves seek. That was the true lesson that had been taught on that plane, a lesson that would ripple through the lives of everyone who had been there, for years to come. And so, as the plane disappeared into the distance, the real journey for Todd, and for everyone who had been a part of that flight, had only just begun.